Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Starting with a question here. It says we keep hearing that it's better for people to divorce than to live in an unhappy relationship even though the family remains intact. The question says, is it true that that's better? Well, to give a simple answer, yes, I think so. Here's one of the reasons. Children don't see these relationships the same way the parents do. You know, if you're born into a pattern in a family, whatever that pattern is, that's normal for the child. But let's look at it. Suppose they divorce. I've heard many couples say, well, we don't want to rear our children, don't want to bring them up in an unhappy family. Okay, suppose they divorce. Chances are the children are going to go with a mother. A divorced mother is typically distressed. She's overworked. She doesn't particularly have good relationship with her children, particularly sons. Single-parent mothers, for reasons that are not quite clear, seem to have much more difficulty with sons than they do daughters, or the sons have more difficulty in the relationships. I'm not blaming the mothers. I've commented on this sort of thing before. The mothers sometimes are extraordinary. They do everything right as far as any objective evidence goes. But they still seem to have more trouble with boys than they do girls. So the answer to the question, fix it. Most people get married for good reasons. Most people think they've made the right choice. And that may go on for years. And then along comes somebody who says, I'm unhappy. Well, nobody ever promised you eternal happiness, not in this world. So fix it. Spend half as much time fixing the relationship and the marriage as you will trying to adjust to a divorce situation, and things are going to turn out better. That's the old-fashioned logic. If it's not working, fix it. If it is working, don't fix it. Here's another question. Does have divorce increased? Not lately. Divorces seem to be settling down, and what's interesting, of course, probably think of it the same way I do when I hear a question like that, is that there are obviously fewer people getting married. So naturally divorces would be decreasing. I think that's logical. We all know so many people live together without benefit of marriage, so there's no divorce. And the evidence, though, when you get into research it, when you keep all of those things constant, trying to keep them constant in doing research, it's still true that divorces are decreasing, the percentage. Now, it may be that the people who marry are getting married later, older. People who marry older are not as likely to divorce as the very young. We've known that since we started looking at these things. And older people marry, the better marriage they tend to make, the more settled they are, the fewer stresses, they don't have to work as hard, they have better opportunities. So maybe there are other things, or whatever. The answer is divorces seem to be stopping. Now, here's another question. I found this question rather interesting. We've talked several times over the period of years about girls maturing earlier than boys. That's been true ever since people started noticing that there was boys and girls. But in recent years, recent decades actually, girls seem to have been maturing earlier and earlier. The question is that continuing? Well, the interesting thing is yes. It seems to be continuing, and looking into it, there may be a pattern to it. Girls who mature earlier physically also tend to marry earlier. They marry earlier and have children earlier, and their daughters mature earlier. So you have a whole series of things going on. But it's not just maturity. I found a piece of research that was interesting in this question. It had to do with the fact that girls who live with stepfathers mature earlier than those who live with their own parents, their own fathers. There are all kinds of possible explanations for that, but I think the scientific evidence is a little bit deep for most people. But anybody who's really interested in getting into it, pheromones is a word that you'd look up there. Well, here's one comment came from somebody who's been a teacher for 30 years. It says, I'm puzzled about people who seem to be well off or above average, and their children seem to be unhappy. And this teacher of 30 years says she seems to have observed that the children, the individual child's happiness doesn't seem to be necessarily related to the economic status of the family. And she's asking why that's not so. Because generally speaking, the more affluent the family, the fewer problems children have. That's the way it seemed to have been, but there seems to be turnaround here. So in looking at it, trying to get into the question, to try to see what this teacher of 30 years was looking at, we have a pattern. It may be this, that those children who come from families that are above average, what kind of homes do they have? Well, the homes may be above average homes. They may have above average material things. But we also have two parents working. The two parents working makes a big difference. Percentage-wise, in the happiness of a child and the way the child sees things. When we have two parents working in the home, we typically have a lot of stress going on in the homes. Just routine. People trying to meet all the schedules. And I think most people would agree we have many more extra familial activities, that is, activities outside the families today, than we used to have. Used to be that kids could play at home. Now they have to play somewhere else. They have to go to a school, or go to this function, go to that function. But these parents who, when they're both working, oftentimes will substitute material things, giving material things to the children to try to make up for the time they're not spending with the children. And this kind of thing has not been known to lead to happiness. Oh, it's great for the markets, it's great for the advertisers, but it doesn't really come down to building real happiness. The people who focus on money and material things are not focusing on child care. And if they're not focusing on child care, it shows up in the children. Well, here's another one that's also somewhat related. I've seen this too in different kind of questions. And I've answered it, I recall, one time. Not long ago, but the question was, do I believe in assigning tasks to children? Should children in the homes have specific chores? Well, the answer is yes, but the two ways to look at it. Most of us like to see a tidy home, and neat and clean and that sort of thing. But what is it that we put priority on? Is that what we're putting the priority on? We've all gone into homes and we see it. It's very neat, but it doesn't look like it's lived in. We go into another home, it looks like it's lived in. I remember trying to get that across in mental hospitals. It used to be that the thing was to have this hospital always looking like a hospital, and yet people lived there. The patients who were committed and had to live there day in and day out, why couldn't they live there and act like it was a home? be treated as if it was a home. It seemed to work best when we did that. Okay, back to the chores. There are two ways of doing it. I've known couples who are very dedicated, have neat, clean, well cared for homes, using teamwork. There are two different kinds of teams. One team is everybody on the team has a specific job, and when everyone does his or her job, things get done. It works well. Then there's another kind of team where everybody on the team does the chores together, does the assignments together, and there's a difference. The difference is that people are relating to one another as they work together. And in the homes, it seems to have been found best to work this way. That if we have assigned jobs, if I go help my children with their jobs, they come and help me with my jobs. We all get through it quicker. But what have we done in the meantime? We've been interacting. That seems to be better. If we focus on the interpersonal relationships instead of simply getting the job done. I've seen some couples really have difficulty with that. Where efficiency expert, a manager comes along and he says this. Everybody has an assigned task, and if each person does what is assigned, everything works well. Using examples of a football team or something like that, saying everybody can't be the quarterback, everybody can't play center, and so on. There's no argument with that kind of logic. Of course, it works. But what's the goal? If the goal is to have better family relationships, it's been found that if we work together, if I see a child doing a chore and I go in and I help the child with a chore, then the child comes along and helps me. That works better. And that's what I like to see. I like to see homes that look lived in, where people care about each other, certainly. But show me a home that doesn't have anything out of place. You may find it's kind of cold environment. Well, here's another interesting question. Talking about power. As with men, so many women, mothers and wives today working outside the home, shouldn't women have more authority, more power, because they have responsibility for the income? And it's been this way for many, many generations, actually. The one who brings in the income is the one who typically controls most of the things that go on. So power has always been given to the wage earner. That's not a big problem to understand. What we see, though, is that sometimes people forget to talk about what they're working for. We see the emphasis on material things. We see the emphasis on acquiring material goods. And they're working for money. And the children are told that, well, I can't be with you and I can't go to your whatever and I can't be with you while you study, or I can't do this because I have to go to my other job or something. Power is a strange sort of thing. You know, when we first become parents, well, even before that, when we get married, most of us got married under similar circumstances, regardless of where. Our circumstances were that we made certain promises and commitments. We promised really to provide for the other one, in sickness and in health, for better, for worse, for richer, for poor, basically until death do us part. A lot of people leave out the until death nowadays, don't they? But what we were really doing when we got married was we were assuming responsibility for the other person, as well as ourselves. Children, when they're born, we exercise all the power. We pick up a child, we do things for the child, but we also do things to the child. We pick them up, we keep them out of trouble, we clean them, we do whatever is necessary. And that's what power is. Power is the ability to affect change, to make change happen, to cause it to happen. Authority, on the other hand, is the ability to command it, to ask others to do it, and will be respected. So this thing about power in the home, children learn power, and then they learn that it gradually tapers off into authority relationship. So it doesn't matter, I don't think it matters so much who makes the most money in the family, if these couples will talk about it. And whoever's job is more important, that's where the family needs to go. But to have it talked over, have it discussed, have agreements on what the purpose is. The power and the authority, and I'm well aware that some men just can't release that. They just can't seem to accommodate. But I'm also aware that some women insist on that same tenacity as men hang on. Some women are fighting for it. And I think when we see those two things, we're seeing problems. Until another time, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Have a good one. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Previously, we had questions about power in families and talked a little bit about authority and responsibility. I'd like to touch on something like that again. You know, any of us parents have responsibility. Responsibility is something that most of us understand. But we sometimes forget. We can't delegate. We can't give our responsibility to somebody else. That's a very old principle in management. If you have the authority to do something, you can transfer that authority to somebody else. Get somebody else who's willing to do something, to follow your instructions. Give them the authority to make decisions. That's pretty simple. And all of us parents do that. Children growing up gradually, year by year and that sort of thing. But we're always giving them a little more authority to make more and more decisions. That's the way it should be. That's a happy state of affairs. What we're also seeing is that too many people are assuming they no longer have responsibility. Now, this is set up by law, and you think about it. I heard a man the other night just really tearing into all kinds of reasons why the state of Vermont ought to give certain people the right to marry, to avoid discrimination. I posed a question to him. I said, "Are you against all discrimination?" And he was, of course. I said, "Well, I certainly am not. I've tried to teach a lot of people in my lifetime. I try to teach them to be more discriminating and to know what they're discriminating about, to be good at it. There's some things that may not make any sense to be just discriminating, but there are things that are essential." And I asked this man who was so infuriated, I said, "I heard you say you had children. Do your children have the same authority that you have in your home? Do your children have the same rights and privileges that you have?" He said, "Well, of course not." I said, "Are you discriminating?" He kind of sat back. That was all he had. He couldn't seem to relate to that and admit that, yes, obviously there are times of discrimination and prejudice that are essential. In family life, of course, but in ordinary circumstances. We hear so many people going out and beating a drum to do away with all discrimination. Now, discernment's a good word. Discrimination is a good word. if you learn what and how and when to use it. And I hope people learn to do it better. I'd like for people not to discriminate on the basis of my looks, unless they want to discriminate in a positive way. A halo effect. Think I'm better looking than I am. Think I'm a better person than I am. I don't object to that. And that would be discrimination and prejudice as well. But I'd rather be given a fair shake most of the time. That's what I wanted to comment about the family and responsibility and authority. Let's be judicious about it. Let's use good judgment about what we are discriminating about. And just to have a wide open season against all discrimination doesn't make any sense to me. Here's another one. It says, not long ago I heard you say, quoting, if you want somebody to like you, get them to do something for you. Does that work? And the person saying, how does it work? Yes, it works. I wish I could claim credit for it. I recall that question being answered months ago. But I didn't make it up, but I read it, and it certainly has worked. I've used it many times. If we invest in something, we like what we invest in. We make a decision to do something, we're more inclined to favor whatever we've decided to do than something else. Once we make a decision, our feelings and our attitudes tend to go with our decisions. Pretty simple. If you want somebody to like you, ask the person to do something for you. Now, there's another element to this also. Most of us don't want to seem inadequate. If I have to ask somebody for help, I'm labeling myself that I'm in need and I'm not adequate. So some of us, particularly those of us who have so-called male egos, we're reluctant to ask for directions. We're reluctant to do a lot of things that are unnecessary. If we'd ask for help, we could get it. Sometimes it'd be much more comfortable, particularly when we get lost, things like that. But it works for little children. It works for old people. If I want you to like me, I ask you to do something for me. And if you do it, chances are you feel okay about it. If we are honest about it, it tends to make for better relationships. If I'm doing something for you, I feel more adequate. I'm willing to be of service. I don't want to be used and misused, but I'm willing to be of service. Try it with a little child. If you want to make a little child feel good about something, be honest about it and ask the youngster to do something for you. I think you'll find that it works, and works very well. Here's a question that's kind of interesting and complicated. Some of you may have been through this sort of thing, and some of you may have been through it and wish you hadn't. Some of you may not have arrived at this yet, but we all have the opportunity. The question was, how do I go about teaching sex education to my 3-year-old girl and my 5-year-old son? It's a simple, straightforward question. Well, the answer, though, is kind of complicated, because the person who asked has already been at the job 5 years. Having a 5-year-old son means that person has already been a model, has been teaching, whether or not she intended to, has been helping a child learn about maleness and femaleness. Most everybody is aware today about sonograms, and we're knowing that children are male and female a long time before they're born, and actually they act differently because they're male and female, even before birth. At least I've heard many women talk about that sort of thing. They could tell whether it was a boy or a girl long before sonograms came into being. But let's look about what is this sex education? Sex education, when most people hear it, they think of a sex act, an act of copulation. That has very little to do with sex education. Most sex education has to do with learning to be male and female, learning the social role, learning what gender is about. And by the time children are 3 years old, most of them have a pretty good idea of what gender identity is. They can tell you about it. They can pick it out. They can identify it. At 3, I've been involved in research at different times in doing that. Sex education, I think, is done the wrong way in most places today, because most sex education is done by governmental programs, and governmental programs intentionally have no moral basis to them. Their basis is to be free of any religion, and I think that's wrong. I'm prejudiced. I talked to you about being prejudiced a while ago. I'll admit it. I'm prejudiced. I think we were created male and female, and I think we have different duties and obligations different times in our life. These things can be socially defined, and different societies will define them differently. But what seems to be best is children are born into families where there's a male and a female, and that seems to be best in the long run. Now, if you go along with my prejudice, excuse me, you know that God created male and female, and that wasn't an accident, any more than God's an accident. And some people don't believe in God, and they think God's an accident, or it's just something that people believe in. They want to believe in it. Most people say, okay, you want to believe in that? Go ahead. But I don't go along that way. I think sex education should be based on certain moralities. I'm one of the few people in the North Country who's had extensive training in sex education. I had to do an internship in my doctoral studies in sex education. I didn't want to, but I was required to do so. Because at the school, Florida State University, it was considered at that time that you weren't properly educated in family life unless you were thoroughly familiar with sex education. And that was one of the strong points I learned why Plattsburgh State University, college, recruited me, because I did have that. And New York State was very gung-ho at the time, and they called it family life education, but really what they really wanted to teach was sex education. So I taught courses in sex education to teachers. But I don't like it. I don't like the direction it goes. I think parents ought to be the teachers. I think parents are the best teachers. Excuse me, it should be consistent. What the home teaches, the school should teach, the community should teach, the church should teach. Regardless what church you go to, have the consistency and dependability that the child learns what male and femaleness is, what gender identity is. Now, it used to be we didn't concern ourselves with these things. 100 years ago, people didn't think it was important. They just think, well, you set a good example, you give children a moral basis, they'll grow up okay, they'll turn out okay. You know, they did. Today we have untold numbers of people involved in trying to do programs to teach children about sex education and what's happening. I don't think the results are good. I don't think they're good at all. Sometimes we're looking at these things, and we think, and I've heard them discussed by many well-intentioned, educated people, they're saying they have to correct what the family's not doing. Well, number one, I don't think that's the best assumption. First, show me the family, and the family as a group, the family as a whole, the families in a society. Show me the families aren't doing a good job. How do you measure a good job? You measure it by the product. Do children grow up to take their places as adults in that society? Are they happy? Are they well behaved? Are they in turn doing the same thing? That's success. Are the children being taught to question, to challenge everything that comes down the pike? It's a different way of looking at things. If it's working, don't fix it. And these sex education programs so often use techniques that aren't really acceptable to me. I think if you've listened to some of the mothers, the parents, and fathers, I had a group of women come to see me one time. It was very interesting. They were concerned because their children in school had been given tests. And the one who made the best grades were the ones who could use the most words for the same thing, mostly having to do with sex. It's a sex education class. Dirty words, filthy words, obscene, profane, whatever. The one who could put down more words in a class got the highest grade, regardless of the nature of it. And these women, these mothers, were concerned. What were they supposed to do about it? How were they supposed to manage this situation? It was a real crisis situation for these parents. These were the same words they had worked hard to have their children not learn, not to hear in their families. And yet right here in the classroom were circumstances that the children were being taught words that were unacceptable in the children's homes. A very real puzzle. Sex education should be done by parents. It starts when you first see the child. You've already been working at it. Your attitudes, your actions, you model it. It's not based on a specific fact of information. Think about it. Until another time, I'm Dr. John Middleton, Family Life in the North Country. Have a good one. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Start with today, we're talking about some young people. Said, why do you think young teenagers today are so gullible to about anything that comes down the pike? Gullible. Well, I'm not sure. You know, young teenagers have always been gullible throughout history. That's not anything particularly different. That is, they're more gullible than older teenagers are young adults. I think we could all agree with that. Just like children. They're not quite adults, and so that's why we call them that. But then we have another thing that's going on. All kids have always wanted, remember when you wanted to look older? Kids want to be thought of as older, more mature. Girls do all sorts of things. You see little girls dressing in mama's clothes. Boys doing all sorts of things to try to look older. Yeah. So part of this looking older and trying to be older today, and we have so much emphasis in the media about this sort of thing that sometimes it's called pseudo-maturity. Kids are learning things that they've never learned before. They're doing things that basically most kids didn't do openly before, at least. And it's a pseudo-maturity. Some people have even called it pseudo-stupidity, because they act stupid, but they're not really stupid. They just sort of act like it sometime and trying to have it. We have a lot of programs trying to influence children. We have certainly a lot of media advertising, directing to children. And the children are getting different messages. It's, I think, pretty clear that young people today have a much harder time knowing what's right and wrong than people my age. When we grew up, it was much more black and white. It was much more cut in stone. Deep impressed on any child, deeply impressed on what was right and wrong. That doesn't mean that we always operated that way. I did a lot of things I knew were clearly wrong, but I knew where the boundary was. I knew what the limit was. I knew what was right and what was wrong. And I think as I've watched children, young people, it is so clear to me that it's not clear to the young people. And why should it be? What do they see? How much time do most of them spend in front of a television set? And the values, the morality that's coming across is anything but clear. We have situational ethics being promoted today. Humanistic philosophy. Situational ethics. If you feel good about something, then that makes it right. If you feel it's right, then it is right. Your own conscience. Be yourself. Follow your own conscience. Well, that's kind of hard to do sometimes. And think you're doing the right thing, and you may not know. Well, we're also seeing young people caught up in this age of uncertainty. They have more material things, but less security in the subjective, less security in those things which count. Think of it a moment this way. If you listen to the music today that young people really seem to go after, don't you find, as I do, there seems to be a lot of hostility and anguish in the music? I've wondered about that. Why are these people so mad at the world? You have music that's being directly iconoclastic. It's attacking anything that's considered of value. I don't listen to it, but I read about it. Some music talks about killing people, killing authority figures, killing police. Why does that appeal to people? I don't really have a good answer for that. But I think a lot of young people today, to get back to the question, I think a lot of young people today are being helped to be gullible, being taught that anything that you want to do is right for you. And what do they want to do? They want to act old. They want to appear old. You can look at some of these people. It's sad. I was over at a school recently and was observing. I was observing seniors in their particular little lounge area. I was looking at some of the kids and what they were doing, trying to look so old, and it was a little puzzling to me. How are kids taught today? You heard of brainstorming. Brainstorming. It's a good technique for some things. But you get children who are impressionable. You get children who are not sure of their own values being ingrained deeply because their parents aren't sure of their values sometimes. The parents today were reared in the same basic type influences. But you get a group of students together in a classroom and say, today we're going to talk about whatever. There are no wrong or right answers, just whatever your view is, your opinion is, express it. Brainstorming, value-free. The value references are the humanistic references. Then you wonder why the kids are gullible. They're being taught to be gullible. They're being taught to accept anything, And you hear it so often. Young people today say, well, no, I don't believe in thus and so, but I respect somebody else's right to it. Take abortion. How many times you heard about that? No, I wouldn't get an abortion. I don't believe in abortion. I wouldn't help anybody get an abortion. But I believe in somebody else's right. That's so common to hear expressions like that, regardless what the issue is. Well, here's another question comes up. It says, do I think it is better for there to be closed or open records about adoption? Well, it's an interesting question. I've seen it both ways. I used to be very strongly the opinion of closed records. I've seen it work out well. I've also seen open records. So today I think it depends a lot on the circumstances. I've heard of, I haven't seen it, but I have heard of families, the adopted family and the biological family being open all the way through and having regular communications, working well. I've worked with a number of gray market adoptions. Legal, not anything illegal about it, but not going through agencies, going through a court. And I've seen that kind of adoption work out well. I've seen adoptions work out well when the adoptive parents came to mental hospitals and picked up the babies directly on the day of birth from the mother, who was a mentally ill person. People would say, oh, that's stacking the cards against them. Well, I've seen them work out well. But let's look back a step. Just take a step backwards a moment. What are we really looking at? Are the results that we're talking about being favorable or unfavorable? Are they dependent upon the kind of record keeping? There are so many variables here. Like the situation I just mentioned about a child born to a person who's mentally ill. Some of those turned out beautiful, in spite of the fact that the mother was mentally ill. Well, what was going on? Was the adoptive parents making up and compensating? No, if we think that's inevitable, that the child of a mentally ill mother is going to also develop mental illness, then we're making the presumptions that we know what mental illness is. And we may not know as much about those kind of things as we think we do. And I've spent a lifetime studying it, and I know I don't know as much about it as I used to think I knew. Much clearer today of what I don't know than what I do know. But adoptions, I've worked with orphans' homes. You don't even see orphans' homes anymore. When I was a psychologist for the Texas Department of Mental Health, it included, the mental health department, included the state orphans' homes. And so that was part of my function at times to work with orphans' homes. I watched those kids. Most of them turned out well. Most of them made good families. And that's always been a reference, because I worked with it in that circumstance as a young professional, and that's been my reference since then. I've seen some of these children who came from very adverse circumstances, who would grow up, become good family members, good parents themselves, and rear good, healthy children. I give a lot of credit to that. So sometimes these adoption variables that we look at, that may not be what we're really looking at. We may be looking at different things and calling it the records. I've seen some very bad results sometimes, but also some very good ones. Here's another question, rather interesting. Is there any truth to dream analysis? Dreams. Now, we all dream. There's truth in that. It depends on what one calls truth, I guess. So we have several truths. Let's go through several truths. It's true that people dream, particularly healthy people. I say healthy because it's been found that a brain that's been damaged may not dream. May, but it may not. It's also true that some people don't remember their dreams and some people do. That's a truth. It's also true that with practice one can learn to remember dreams better. I know when I was first studying dream analysis as part of psychoanalytic work, I'd kept a notepad by my bed, and I learned to awake and write down my dreams. It was very productive. Well, people can learn to do things like that with practice. It's also true that dreaming is a normal function of the brain-mind, and I say brain-mind as a hyphenated word because we don't know which is which, actually. The function of the brain is the mind. It's also true that, and interesting, you think about it, most of the time when we're dreaming, we're not acting out. We're not doing things that we're doing in our dreams. In other words, if we're dreaming about running, we're not running. We're dreaming about flying, we're not flying. Most of the time when we're dreaming, we're lying perfectly still. Oh, our eyes may be in rapid eye movement, that sort of thing. That's an indication of dreaming. But in truth, we're most often not doing anything physically. There's some good research that that's not an accident. We also know today that the mind doesn't go to sleep, the brain doesn't go to sleep. When I first studied this sort of thing and studied neuroanatomy, first studied electroencephalograms, a recording of the brain waves, electrical energies of the brain, we had the assumption that the alpha and the beta waves died down and the delta waves came into being. In other words, we thought the brain, part of it went to sleep. Now we know that's not the truth. We know that the brain, sure, these waves change, but the brain seems to be always awake, and it's just in a different mode. We also know, as far as the truth, about dreams, that the psychoanalysts built up a whole dictionary. I have books over here on dream analysis based on psychoanalysis. A whole dictionary of symbols. And most of the symbols had to do with what was called repressed sexual energies. There was never any objective evidence for that. These were assumptions that were built up. Freud started it in his book, Dream Interpretation. I read it, practically memorized it. And most of us who studied this sort of thing along the way, we did all kinds of things like that. What was the truth of the matter? The truth of the matter is that there was no objective evidence. I have other dream books here that were taking specialists who were dream analysts, that they didn't know that other people were interpreting the dream, specialists though, each one of them interpreting the same dream and the different results that they have. It suggests that there wasn't a clear opinion about some of these things. That what we thought we knew, we didn't know. We now know that the brain functions according to the chemistries. We didn't used to know that. Different chemicals cause us to dream. Different chemicals cause us to be awake. Different chemicals keep us from doing all these physical things in our dreams that we would do if we were awake. So when somebody asks me about, is there any truth to dream analysis? There are a lot of truths, but they may not be what we used to think they were. I have some people today who, clients or patients, who very strongly have the opinion about their dreams being really representative and predictive of their behavior in their future. Well, most of the time it doesn't hurt anybody to believe that sort of thing. But there may be other explanations. For another time, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Have a good one.